The cold slam of the gavel cracked through the air like a shot, silencing every whisper in the courtroom. "Order!" Judge Malcolm Creighton's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. His thick white hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his steel-gray eyes swept across the crowded room with an unmistakable edge of disdain. "This court finds the defendant guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the audience like a rising tide. At the center of it all stood 17-year-old Liana Brooks, her frame rigid, her hands clenched at her sides. Her warm brown eyes, once full of youthful hope, were now wide with disbelief. Her knees wobbled slightly under the weight of a decision that felt impossibly heavy. She hadn't done anything wrong. She knew that. Her friends knew that. Anyone who had genuinely paid attention to the evidence should have known that. But Judge Creighton didn't care about the truth. The charge, theft of a teacher's luxury watch. The evidence, none. Just the word of one student with a known history of dishonesty, and a judge whose contempt for Liana was obvious from the moment she stepped foot in his courtroom. She had come dressed in her press school uniform, her braids neat, her posture respectful. Her principal had testified on her behalf. So had multiple classmates. But none of it mattered. Judge Creighton seemed to have made up his mind before the proceedings even began. From the back of the room, Liana's mother, Denise Brooks, leapt to her feet. "This isn't right," she cried out, her voice thick with emotion. "My daughter didn't do this." "Sit down, or you'll be held in contempt of court," Creighton snapped, his lips curled into a sneer. Denise froze, trembling. Liana's vision blurred with tears as she felt the officer's hand close around her arm. "Wait," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Can I just make a phone call?" The judge let out a sarcastic laugh. "To who?" "Your boyfriend." Liana straightened her back, her throat tightening. "No, to my dad." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as she pulled out her phone and dialed. The silence was deafening. "Hey, Daddy," she said, her voice cracking. "The judge just said I'm guilty." He didn't even listen. There was a pause on the other end. Then a calm, steady voice replied, "I'm on my way." She lowered the phone slowly and turned to face the bench again. Her cheeks were still wet with tears, but the fear was gone from her eyes. She stood taller, steadier. "My father," she said clearly, her voice growing stronger with every word, "is the United States Attorney General." The room froze. Judge Creighton's face went pale. He fumbled for his gavel, suddenly unsure. Outside, a murmur grew among the reporters clustered on the courthouse steps. 20 minutes later, 2 black SUVs with tinted windows rolled up outside the building. Secret Service agents spilled out first, scanning the area with practiced eyes. Then came a tall, imposing figure in a dark blue suit. He moved with quiet authority, each step deliberate and precise. This was Quentin Brooks, the highest-ranking legal officer in the country. The man who oversaw the enforcement of federal law. The man with the power to dismantle entire legal systems with a single directive. He said nothing at first. He didn't greet the judge, didn't acknowledge the attorneys. He walked straight to his daughter and embraced her gently. Then he turned. "I want the full court record from today," he said sharply. "Every word of testimony, every submitted document, surveillance footage from the school, all of it. Now." Creighton tried to maintain his composure. "Mr. Brooks, I assure you we followed." "You don't get to speak," Quentin interrupted, his voice calm but edged with steel. "You made a ruling based on one student's word, a student with a known disciplinary history, with no corroborating evidence. No surveillance. No confession. You ignored multiple defense witnesses. And I have reason to believe this is not the first time you've done something like this." Outside, reporters scrambled for coverage. Inside, camera phones lit up like stars. Judge Creighton's pale face appeared on every live stream, every tweet, every feed. Quentin turned to the officer, still gripping Liana's wrist. "Let go of my daughter." "Now." The officer obeyed without a word. Liana stepped back beside her father, her heart pounding for an entirely different reason now. The courtroom that had swallowed her dignity only moments ago suddenly felt like a stage, and the spotlight was no longer on her shame, but on a man's corruption. Quentin pointed at the school principal seated at the back. You testified the security cameras weren't working the day the watch went missing. Is that correct? Yes, sir, the principal replied, his voice quivering. Quentin held up a printed document. Then explained why the maintenance log shows the cameras were serviced just 3 days before the alleged theft. I don't know. You'll answer that under oath, Quentin snapped. Judge Creighton slammed his gavel again. This is highly irregular. No. What's irregular, Quentin said as he stepped forward, voice unwavering, is a courtroom that treats black children like criminals before a single fact is established. This court is now under federal investigation. The gavel slipped from Creighton's fingers and hit the bench with a dull clatter. That same evening, news stations exploded with headlines. Federal investigation launched into Judge Malcolm Creighton following controversial guilty verdict of black teen. By sunrise, Judge Creighton's history was laid bare. Dozens of cases involving black and brown teenagers, all convicted on flimsy or non-existent evidence. The stats were damning in cases where white students were accused of similar offenses. Not a single one had ever been found guilty under his watch. But Quentin Brooks didn't stop at clearing his daughter's name. He went further. He reopened every questionable ruling made in Creighton's court over the last 10 years. Each case was reviewed by a federal commission. One by one, families who had once lost everything, their children, their opportunities, their faith in justice, began receiving phone calls they thought would never come. Liana's record was expunged. The false accusation dismissed entirely. The real thief, a student named Kennedy Monroe, was caught after investigators uncovered a series of texts to a friend. I slipped it in Liana's bag when no one was looking. She won't be able to talk her way out of this. Kennedy was suspended immediately. She was charged with filing a false police report. Her family tried to downplay the incident as a prank gone wrong. But the justice system, now under a very different spotlight, wasn't interested in excuses. Within a week, Judge Creighton was suspended from the bench. Within 2, he was removed entirely. His credentials stripped. His office vacated. The same courthouse steps where he'd once strutted with arrogance were now filled with protesters and chants. He didn't leave to applause, he left to boos, camera flashes, and the full glare of national scrutiny. And Liana? She didn't shrink from the moment. She didn't disappear. Days later, standing in front of her school, surrounded by her classmates and reporters, she held a microphone in one hand and her head high. I was almost taken from my home and locked away for something I didn't do, she said. Not because there was proof, but because of what I look like. I was lucky. I had someone powerful in my corner. But what about the kids who don't? What happens to them? The crowd went silent, leaning in. That's why I want to be a lawyer, she said, voice steady. So I can be that voice. That protection. For someone else. Cheers erupted. Reporters scrambled to broadcast her words. Overnight, her story became a symbol not just of injustice, but of resilience and the power of truth spoken aloud. College offers came flooding in. Civil rights groups reached out. She was interviewed on morning shows, her face gracing the covers of magazines. But she never let the spotlight distract her from her mission. Liana Brooks, the girl who once stood accused, now stood for something far greater. Justice. And this time, the world was listening. But even as the media frenzy swirled around her, Liana Brooks stayed grounded. Fame had never been her goal. She wasn't interested in being a symbol. She wanted to make change real, lasting, systemic change. She started with her school. Liana returned to Roosevelt High not with resentment, but with resolve. She asked for a meeting with the superintendent, with the school board, with the teachers' union. Most of them were stunned. They had expected her to leave the school, not walk straight into the lion's den. I'm not here to yell, she began. I'm here to fix what's broken. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, a task force was formed not because anyone wanted to, but because no one could justify saying no to her. Liana had evidence, research, and clarity. She pointed out the lack of equity in how discipline was handed out, how surveillance footage was conveniently unavailable only when it affected black students, how teachers weren't being trained on racial bias or trauma-informed education. Her voice didn't tremble. It rang with purpose. And then she launched something no one expected: the Brooks Justice Initiative, a student-led legal education program to teach high schoolers, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, about their rights, the legal system, and how to defend themselves in court. It starts with knowing the rules, she told her first group of students in a packed classroom. Because when you don't know the law, people will use it against you. But when you do, that's when you start using it to fight back. The initiative caught fire. Within weeks, students from across the district were attending weekend seminars. Lawyers volunteered. Judges reached out. Law students from Howard, Georgetown, and Columbia signed up to mentor. Quentin Brooks quietly funded the program, but refused to let his name be attached. "This is hers," he said simply. But not everyone was thrilled. Certain local officials, particularly those who had worked closely with Judge Creighton in the past, began feeling the heat. Old rulings were being questioned. Decisions once swept under the rug were being unearthed. And then came the threats. It started with anonymous emails. "Watch her back. She's stirring up trouble. Send her to private school before she ends up like Sandra Bland." Denise Brooks was terrified. She wanted to pull her daughter out, send her to a prep academy in New York that had already offered Liana a full scholarship. But Liana refused. "If I leave now, what happens to the others?" she asked quietly. "They'll just go after someone else next." She stayed, and then she went further. Liana requested access to public records for all juvenile cases presided over by Judge Creighton over the last decade. What she found broke her. There were kids, dozens of them, who had lost everything: scholarships, futures, reputations. Many of them had been first-generation college applicants, kids whose entire families had rallied behind them. Some had pleaded guilty just to avoid longer sentences, even when they hadn't committed the crime. She called them. She met them. She listened. And then she started telling their stories. Not on TV, not on social media, but in a courtroom. With the help of a civil rights attorney, she filed a federal class action suit against the county's Juvenile Justice Department for systemic racial discrimination under Creighton's bench. The courtroom was packed on the day of the first hearing. Liana, now 18, walked in with her head held high, wearing a plain navy dress, holding a binder of affidavits, timelines, and witness statements. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a plaintiff, and her presence shook the room. One by one, former students testified. Their stories echoed with pain, confusion, and injustice. "I was expelled for something I didn't do. My mom had to sell our car to pay legal fees. I missed my chance at a scholarship. I ended up working 3 jobs. They made me feel like I was a criminal, and I started to believe it." When it was Liana's turn, she didn't speak as someone seeking revenge. "I don't want to destroy the system," she said calmly. "I want to rebuild it." The judge overseeing the suit, a seasoned woman with years on the bench, watched Liana with silent admiration. By the time the hearing ended, the county had already begun preparing a settlement offer. But Liana had a condition. "No hush money," she said. "I want public acknowledgement. I want policy changes. And I want a fund created for the students whose lives were derailed." It took months of negotiation, but eventually the county caved. A formal apology was issued on the courthouse steps. Judge Creighton's rulings were officially reviewed and, in many cases, overturned. A $3.8 million restitution fund was established. Liana didn't keep a penny for herself. She funneled everything into expanding the Brooks Justice Initiative. By the time she turned 19, the initiative had reached 5 states. By 20, it had a permanent office in D.C. By 21, Liana was admitted into Howard University's School of Law under a full-ride scholarship, not because of who her father was, but because of what she had already done before she even graduated college. And yet, she still visited Roosevelt High once a semester. She walked the same hallways, sit in the same cafeteria, talk to the new students. "Don't let anyone tell you what justice is supposed to look like," she'd say. "Make them show you with action." As for Quentin Brooks, he quietly stepped down from his position as Attorney General a year after the case closed. When asked by a reporter why he was retiring, he smiled and said, because my daughter's just getting started. He wasn't wrong. By 24, Liana had argued and won her first civil rights case in federal court. It involved a young boy wrongfully expelled for recording a teacher's racial slur. The boy was reinstated. The teacher fired. The case sparked national debate about student rights and digital evidence. Liana didn't seek headlines, but the headlines came anyway. By 25, she was on the cover of Time, the new face of justice. When asked what drove her, she said, "Because I remember what it felt like to stand in that courtroom completely innocent and realize the judge saw me as guilty the moment I walked in. I will never forget that feeling, and I'll spend my life making sure no one else has to." At 28, she returned to Roosevelt High, this time not as a student, not as a guest speaker, but as the commencement speaker for graduation. The gymnasium was packed. Her name was chanted before she even reached the podium. But she waited for silence before she spoke. "I was 17 when this place almost broke me," she began. "But I stood back up because I had a family that believed in me, a father who showed up, and a truth I refused to let go of." She paused, letting the moment settle. You will face moments that make you question everything: who you are, what you're worth, whether it's even worth fighting. I'm here to tell you, it is. Every single time. The entire auditorium rose in applause. And this time, Liana allowed herself to feel it. Not as a girl who was once wrongfully accused, but as a woman who had become a force for good. A protector, a builder of justice, a name that would echo far beyond courtrooms. Liana Brooks had stood in front of injustice and refused to bow. And because of that, she changed everything.